The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stone corridors of the palace. As Officer James Mitchell completed his rounds, he had served the royal family for 12 years. His dedication unwavering through changing seasons and shifting politics within the palace walls, but something in the air felt different that particular Tuesday morning in late autumn. James paused near the East Wing entrance, adjusting his ceremonial uniform as he observed the unusual activity. Staff members hurried past with worried expressions, their whispers echoing off the high ceilings. He noticed Margaret, one of the senior housekeepers, who had worked at the palace for nearly 3 decades. Wringing her hands as she spoke urgently to a younger maid, the officer had developed an instinct over his years of service. A sixth sense for when something was amiss behind the carefully maintained facade of royal normalcy. Today, that instinct screamed at him to pay attention. He positioned himself near a marble pillar, maintaining his professional stance while his eyes tracked the movements around him. Princess Kate had arrived at the palace earlier that week for what was scheduled as a routine visit to discuss upcoming charitable events. James had seen her many times before, always gracious and kind to the staff, remembering names and asking about their families. She carried herself with a natural warmth that endeared her to everyone who worked within these historic walls. However, her presence this time seemed to cause an unusual stir among certain members of the household. James had noticed Camilla's private secretary making multiple trips between offices, carrying folders that she clutched tightly to her chest. Phone calls were made behind closed doors, and meetings were scheduled at odd hours. On the 3rd day of Kate's visit, James was assigned to the corridor outside the drawing room where an informal tea was taking place. He stood at attention, his face expressionless as trained, but his ears caught fragments of conversation that drifted through the partially open door. Camilla's voice carried a sharp edge that James had rarely heard before. She was discussing arrangements, speaking about tradition and proper protocol. But there was something in her tone that suggested these were not mere administrative concerns. She mentioned something about certain quarters being unsuitable and renovations that needed to happen immediately. Kate's softer voice responded with politeness, though James detected a note of confusion in her words. She seemed to be asking questions about decisions that had apparently been made without her knowledge or input. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, and when the door finally opened, Kate emerged with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. James noticed how she paused in the corridor, taking a deep breath before continuing on her way. He had seen that look before on people trying to maintain composure when they felt cornered or overwhelmed. It troubled him, but he knew his place. A royal guard observed and protected, but did not interfere in family matters. The next morning brought more peculiar developments. James was repositioned to the administrative wing, a change in his usual rotation that came without explanation. From this new vantage point, he witnessed a steady stream of visitors to Camilla's office. Lawyers, property managers, and senior palace officials filed in and out throughout the day. During his lunch break, James sat in the staff dining area, where palace workers gathered to share meals and gossip. The conversation inevitably turned to the recent tensions everyone had noticed, but no one fully understood. Martha, who had worked in the palace kitchens for 20 years, spoke in hushed tones about the special meals being prepared and then canceled at the last minute. Dinner plans would be arranged for Princess Kate, only to have the venue changed or the timing shifted with barely an hour's notice. It seemed like someone was deliberately making her stay uncomfortable. Thomas, a footman with access to many parts of the palace, mentioned overhearing a heated discussion between senior staff members about living arrangements and proper accommodations for different members of the royal family. The debate seemed to center on who had the right to occupy certain rooms and apartments within the palace complex. James listened carefully, piecing together a puzzle that was becoming increasingly disturbing. Individual incidents might be dismissed as coincidence or miscommunication, but the pattern emerging suggested something more calculated that evening. As James made his rounds through the quieter sections of the palace, he came across a scene that would change everything. He heard voices coming from a small meeting room that was supposed to be empty. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see Camilla sitting with 2 men in expensive suits, Documents were spread across the table, and Camilla was pointing to specific pages while speaking in an animated manner. James could not hear everything clearly, but certain phrases carried to where he stood in the shadows. Words like restructuring, appropriate residences, and maintaining proper hierarchy punctuated the conversation. One of the men asked about potential resistance or objections, and Camilla waved her hand dismissively. She said something about traditions being flexible when necessary and that certain changes simply need to be accepted as inevitable. The other man mentioned legal considerations, and Camilla assured him that everything would be handled properly through official channels. James felt his pulse quicken as he realized he was witnessing something significant. This was not ordinary palace business or routine administrative planning. This had the feel of a strategy session, a careful plotting of moves designed to achieve a specific outcome. He carefully backed away from the door, ensuring his footsteps made no sound on the thick carpet. His mind raced with questions about what he should do with this information. As a guard, his duty was to protect the royal family. But from what? And from whom, when the threat seemed to come from within? The following day, James requested a meeting with his superior officer, Captain Reynolds, a man he had served under for 8 years and trusted implicitly. They met in the guard's private office, a small room filled with schedules and security protocols. James chose his words carefully, explaining what he had observed without drawing premature conclusions. He laid out the timeline of events, the unusual activities, the snippets of conversation, and the general atmosphere of tension that had settled over the palace since Kate's arrival. Captain Reynolds listened with a grave expression, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on his desk. When James finished, the captain leaned back in his chair and studied the younger officer for a long moment. The captain explained that there had been rumors circulating at the highest levels of palace security about internal conflicts and disagreements over various matters of protocol and precedence. However, these disputes were generally considered family business, delicate matters that security personnel were expected to navigate with discretion. But if what James was reporting indicated a coordinated effort to force a member of the royal family into an untenable position, that crossed a line. Such actions could have implications for security, public perception, and the stability of the institution itself. Captain Reynolds made a decision. He instructed James to continue his normal duties, but to maintain heightened awareness. They would need more concrete information before taking any action, but they would also need to be prepared to respond if the situation escalated over the next several days. James kept his eyes and ears open while maintaining the appearance of ordinary routine. He noticed that Kate's scheduled appearances were being modified. Events she was meant to attend were suddenly rescheduled or reassigned to other family members. Her input on charitable matters she had championed was being redirected through additional layers of administration. Meanwhile, renovations that had been mentioned in that overheard conversation began to take shape. Workers appeared to assess various apartments and quarters within the palace. Discussions about historical preservation and modern updates provided cover for what James suspected was a more targeted reorganization of living spaces. The tension reached a new level when James overheard an argument between Kate's personal assistant and one of Camilla's staff members. The dispute centered on access to certain rooms and the authority to make decisions about royal schedules. Voices were raised in a way that was highly unusual for the normally diplomatic palace environment. James documented everything in a private journal he kept locked in his quarters. Dates, times, observations, and direct quotes when he could remember them accurately. He knew that if this situation ever required formal investigation, having a detailed record would be essential. One evening, while stationed near the private family areas, James saw Kate walking alone through a gallery lined with portraits of past royals. She stopped before a painting of a queen who had faced her own challenges centuries ago, and James saw her reach up to wipe away a tear. It was a moment of such genuine vulnerability that James felt his resolve harden. Whatever was happening here, whoever was orchestrating these events, they were causing real harm to someone who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. His oath to protect the royal family suddenly took on a deeper meaning. The next morning would bring a discovery that would force James to make the most difficult decision of his career. As he arrived for his early shift, he found an envelope that had been slipped under the door of the guard's office. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief typed message. The message warned that certain documents would be formally presented within 48 hours that would make it effectively impossible for Princess Kate to maintain her current role and position within the palace structure. The note suggested that these documents had been carefully prepared over several months and had the backing of influential supporters. The message was unsigned, but James suspected it came from someone within the administrative staff who had grown uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Perhaps someone who felt that this scheme had gone too far and that someone needed to intervene before it was too late. James showed the note to Captain Reynolds, and together they faced a critical choice. They could maintain their professional distance and allow events to unfold as those in power had planned, or they could take the risk of speaking out, of bringing this hidden scheme into the light where it could be examined and challenged. The decision was complicated by the fact that they would be essentially accusing a senior member of the royal family of acting against another family member's interests. The consequences of such an accusation, if they were wrong or if their evidence was deemed insufficient, would be severe. Their careers would be over, their reputations destroyed. But both men had sworn an oath to serve and protect, and sometimes protection meant standing against threats that came from unexpected directions, even from within the very institution they served. Captain Reynolds picked up his phone and made a call to the head of palace security, requesting an urgent meeting. As James stood in that office, watching his superior take that brave step, he knew that the events set in motion that morning would change everything for everyone involved. The hidden scheme was about to be exposed, and there would be no going back from what came next. The head of palace security, Sir Robert Thornton, was a man who had served the monarchy for over 30 years. He had witnessed scandals, managed crises, and navigated the treacherous waters of royal politics with remarkable skill. When Captain Reynolds and Officer Mitchell entered his private office that afternoon, Sir Robert already sensed this would not be an ordinary meeting. James felt the weight of the moment as he stood before the massive oak desk, where Sir Robert sat reviewing their documented observations. The older man's face remained impassive as he turned page after page of James's journal, occasionally pausing to reread certain passages or study the timeline of events they had constructed. The silence in the room stretched uncomfortably, until Sir Robert finally set down the papers and looked at both men with piercing gray eyes that had seen too much to be easily shocked. He asked them if they understood the gravity of what they were suggesting, the implications of their accusations, and the potential consequences if they pursued this matter further. Captain Reynolds spoke first, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. He explained that they had wrestled with these exact questions for days before deciding to come forward. They were not acting out of personal ambition or seeking to insert themselves into family disputes. They had observed a pattern of behavior that suggested a coordinated campaign to undermine and ultimately remove a member of the royal family through manipulation and bureaucratic maneuvering. Sir Robert leaned back in his chair, his fingers forming a steeple as he contemplated the situation. He revealed that he had been receiving his own reports about unusual activities and tensions within the palace. Other staff members had come to him with concerns, though none had assembled as complete a picture as what James and Captain Reynolds had presented. The security chief made several phone calls, speaking in careful language that revealed nothing to anyone who might be listening on extensions or monitoring palace communications. He scheduled meetings with key personnel and requested certain records be pulled from archives. Then he instructed James and Captain Reynolds to continue their normal duties while he conducted a discreet investigation. What Sir Robert did not tell them was that he had already been contacted by members of the royal family who were concerned about the situation. There were individuals who had noticed the same patterns, who questioned the sudden changes in protocol and the reorganization of responsibilities. They had been watching and waiting for the right moment to act. Over the next 48 hours, James maintained his regular schedule, but he noticed increased activity among senior palace officials. Meetings were being held in secure locations, and there was a palpable sense that something significant was building beneath. The surface calm that the palace always projected to the outside world. Meanwhile, the scheme that Camilla had been orchestrating continued to move forward. James learned from other guards that a formal presentation was scheduled, during which new organizational charts and updated protocols would be unveiled. These changes would effectively reassign many of Kate's responsibilities and redefine her role within the royal structure in ways that would make her position largely ceremonial and far less influential. The day before the scheduled presentation, Sir Robert summoned James to his office once again. This time, there were others present: a senior royal advisor, the palace legal counsel, and several officials whose exact roles James did not immediately recognize. The atmosphere was tense but purposeful. Sir Robert explained that they had spent the past 2 days investigating the claims and gathering additional evidence. What they had discovered confirmed the worst suspicions. There was indeed a comprehensive plan to effectively force Princess Kate out of any meaningful role within the palace, to isolate her from decision-making processes, and to diminish her influence and standing. The legal counsel presented documents showing how various bureaucratic mechanisms had been manipulated. Committee memberships had been quietly restructured. Charitable patronages that Kate had worked hard to build were being transferred to other oversight. Even her living quarters were slated for renovation that would require her to relocate to smaller, less prestigious accommodations under the guise of historical preservation work. Each individual change might have seemed reasonable when presented in isolation, but when viewed together, they formed a clear pattern of marginalization. It was death by 1,000 cuts. A sophisticated campaign designed to make Kate's position so uncomfortable and diminished that she would either accept a drastically reduced role or choose to step away from palace life altogether. The royal advisor, a distinguished woman named Lady Elizabeth Fairfax, spoke with barely controlled anger about the betrayal such actions represented. She explained that the monarchy's strength came from unity and mutual respect among family members. When senior royals turned against each other using bureaucratic warfare rather than honest communication, it weakened the entire institution. The question now was how to respond. Simply blocking the planned presentation would not address the underlying issues or prevent future attempts at manipulation. They needed a strategy that would expose what had been done while also creating safeguards. Against such schemes in the future, Lady Elizabeth proposed a bold approach. Rather than confront Camilla privately, which would allow the situation to be managed quietly and potentially swept under the palace carpets, they would let the presentation proceed. However, they would ensure that all relevant parties were present, including individuals who had been deliberately excluded from the planning process. The presentation was scheduled to take place in the palace's formal conference room, a space normally reserved for meetings with government officials and visiting dignitaries. James was assigned a security detail for the event, positioned where he could observe everything that transpired. The morning of the presentation arrived with deceptive normalcy. Palace staff went about their duties, unaware that the day would mark a turning point in recent royal history. James took his position outside the conference room as senior officials began to arrive. Camilla entered with her team of advisors and assistants, carrying folders and presentation materials. She appeared confident, perhaps even pleased with herself, clearly expecting this meeting to proceed according to her carefully laid plans. Her private secretary set up a projection screen, while others arranged documents on the massive conference table. Then Princess Kate arrived, and James noticed the slight falter in Camilla's expression. Kate was apparently expected to be absent from this meeting, perhaps scheduled for some conflicting engagement that would have conveniently kept her away during the presentation of these life-altering changes. What happened next caused visible shock on Camilla's face. Prince William entered the room, followed by several senior members of the royal family who rarely attended such administrative meetings. Behind them came Sir Robert, Lady Elizabeth, and the Palace Legal Council, along with representatives from the Lord Chamberlain's office. James watched through the partially open door as the room filled with far more people than Camilla had anticipated. This was no longer a simple presentation to a select committee. This had become a formal review with witnesses and decision-makers whose authority could not be easily circumvented. Camilla attempted to maintain her composure, suggesting that perhaps they should reschedule, given the unexpected crowd. But Lady Elizabeth, who had seniority in protocol matters, firmly indicated that they should proceed as planned. After all, if these changes were truly in the best interest of the monarchy, they should withstand scrutiny from all relevant parties. The presentation began awkwardly as Camilla's team outlined their proposed reorganization. They spoke about efficiency and modernization, about respecting tradition while adapting to contemporary needs. They used carefully chosen language designed to make their recommendations sound reasonable and well-intentioned. But as they detailed the specific changes, the true impact became impossible to disguise. Kate would be removed from oversight of several major charitable initiatives she had founded. Her role in family decision-making would be reduced to advisory only, with no voting authority. Her apartments would be relocated to what amounted to guest quarters, justified by claims about maintenance needs and historical preservation requirements. Sir William's face grew increasingly stern as the presentation continued. When the team finally finished and asked if there were any questions, he stood slowly, his presence commanding immediate attention. He spoke with controlled fury about being kept unaware of these sweeping proposals that dramatically affect his wife's position and role. He questioned the authority by which such changes had been developed in secret. Without consultation with the family members most directly affected, he demanded to know who had authorized this initiative, what the true motivations were behind such a comprehensive restructuring. Camilla attempted to respond, explaining that she was simply trying to clarify roles and prevent confusion about responsibilities. She claimed that everything she had proposed was meant to strengthen the monarchy by establishing clearer lines of authority and avoiding overlapping jurisdictions. But Lady Elizabeth interrupted with her own questions. She asked why standard procedures for policy changes had been bypassed. She questioned why legal and protocol offices had been given incomplete information about the scope of these proposals. She demanded to see the authorization documents that would justify such significant restructuring. The legal counsel then presented his findings. He explained that many of the proposed changes exceeded the authority of any single member of the royal family to implement unilaterally. They required formal review and approval through established channels. Some of the bureaucratic maneuvers that had already been initiated were, in fact, procedurally improper and would need to be reversed. James watched Camilla's confident facade crack as the meeting shifted from a presentation to an investigation. Her advisors shuffled papers nervously, clearly unprepared for this level of scrutiny. Some of them appeared genuinely surprised to learn the full scope of what they had been helping to implement, suggesting that even her own team had been given incomplete information. Sir Robert then added his voice to the proceedings. As head of palace security, he expressed grave concerns about the security implications of creating divisions and conflicts within the royal family. He noted that such internal discord could be exploited by those who wished harm to the monarchy. Unity and mutual support among family members were not merely idealistic goals, but practical necessities for institutional security. The room fell silent as the full weight of what had been exposed settled over everyone present. This was not a routine administrative restructuring. This was an attempt by one member of the royal family to systematically diminish another through manipulation of bureaucratic processes and exploitation of her position's authority. Kate, who had remained quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke. Her voice was calm but carried emotional weight that resonated through the room. She said she had devoted herself to serving the monarchy and the people with genuine dedication. She had never sought power or position beyond what was appropriate to her role. She had tried to approach her responsibilities with humility and grace. To discover that all her efforts had been viewed not as service, but as a threat requiring elimination, was deeply painful. She questioned what she could have done to warrant such treatment. What offense she had committed that justified this campaign against her. Her words carried no anger, only hurt and bewilderment, which made them all the more powerful. The meeting concluded without any formal decisions, but with clear understanding that the proposed changes would not be implemented. More importantly, there would be serious discussions about how such a situation had been allowed to develop and what safeguards needed to be established to prevent future abuses of authority. As people filed out of the conference room, James observed the various reactions. Some of Camilla's team appeared relieved that the scheme had been exposed before they became more deeply complicit. Others seemed defensive, unwilling to accept that they had been part of something inappropriate. Camilla herself left quickly, her face composed, but her movements betraying her distress. Kate emerged with William at her side, and James saw her exchange a brief glance with Sir Robert. In that moment passed an acknowledgement of gratitude, a recognition that people throughout the palace had been watching out for her, even when she felt most isolated and vulnerable. The exposure of the scheme marked a turning point. But James knew that the real work of addressing the underlying issues and rebuilding trust had only just begun. The palace had been shaken by this revelation, and the consequences would ripple through its halls for months, or even years to come. The days following the exposed scheme brought an atmosphere of tense uncertainty to the palace. James noticed how conversations would stop abruptly when certain people entered rooms, how staff members chose their words carefully, and how the normal rhythms of palace life had been disrupted by the knowledge that something fundamental had broken down in the family's internal relationships. Senior members of the royal household convened multiple emergency meetings to address the situation. These gatherings took place behind closed doors, but their frequency and duration told their own story. The monarchy was facing a crisis that could not be resolved with simple apologies or superficial reconciliation. James continued his duties, but he found himself treated differently by other staff members. Some approached him with respect, viewing him as someone who had shown courage by speaking up when others remained silent. Others regarded him with suspicion or resentment, seeing him as someone who had broken unspoken rules about discretion and loyalty by exposing internal family conflicts. One afternoon, Lady Elizabeth Fairfax requested a private meeting with James. They met in her office, a book-lined room that reflected her decades of service and deep understanding of royal protocol. She thanked him for his vigilance and willingness to come forward with information that many others would have preferred to ignore. She explained that his actions had prevented a serious injustice, but they had also exposed deeper problems within the palace structure. The fact that such a comprehensive scheme could be developed and nearly implemented without triggering immediate alarms indicated systemic weaknesses that needed to be addressed. Lady Elizabeth told James that a formal review was being conducted to examine how authority was exercised within the palace, how decisions were made, and what checks existed to prevent abuse of position. This review would likely lead to significant changes in procedures and oversight mechanisms. She wanted James to participate in this process, to share his perspective as someone who had witnessed the situation unfold from the ground level. Meanwhile, the confrontation's fallout continued to develop. Camilla had retreated from many of her usual activities, reportedly spending time at one of the family's private estates away from London. Her advisors and staff members who had been most involved in developing the scheme found their roles being quietly reassessed. Some were reassigned to different departments or encouraged to take early retirement. The palace could not publicly discipline them without revealing the full story to the media. But there were ways to manage personnel changes that sent clear messages about accountability without creating public scandal. Kate, for her part, handled the situation with remarkable grace. Rather than demanding public vindication or seeking revenge against those who had tried to undermine her, she focused on her work and maintained her usual warm interactions with palace staff. James observed her thanking security personnel, greeting housekeepers by name, and continuing to approach her responsibilities with the same dedication she had always shown. But there were private moments when the strain showed. James saw her standing alone in the palace gardens one evening, her shoulders slightly slumped, staring at the flowers without really seeing them. The weight of knowing that someone she should have been able to trust had been actively working against her clearly took an emotional toll that no amount of public composure could completely hide. Prince William took a more active role in palace administration following the exposed scheme. He began attending meetings that he had previously delegated to others, asking detailed questions about decisions being made and requiring clear justifications for proposed changes. His message was unmistakable. The days of unchecked authority and secretive maneuvering were over. Sir Robert Thornton implemented new security protocols that went beyond physical protection to include institutional safeguards. Regular audits would be conducted of major administrative decisions. Changes affecting family members' roles or living situations required documented approval from multiple authorities rather than single individuals. Communications and meeting notes would be properly archived to create accountability trails. These changes were presented as modernization efforts, ways to bring palace operations into alignment with contemporary management best practices. But everyone understood their real purpose was to prevent another situation like the one they had just experienced. The British media, always hungry for royal news, sensed that something significant had occurred within palace walls. Reporters noticed the unusual number of official cars coming and going, the cancelled public appearances, and the absence of certain royals from expected events. Speculation began to build. Though the palace's formidable publicity machinery worked overtime to maintain the official narrative of routine, scheduling adjustments in ordinary family matters, James found himself called to additional meetings with Sir Robert and other security officials. They wanted his assessment of staff morale, his observations about how different departments were responding to the changes being implemented, and his recommendations for how to rebuild trust among personnel who had been disturbed by what they had witnessed. In one such meeting, James spoke candidly about the confusion and anxiety he sensed among lower-level staff members. Many felt caught between conflicting loyalties, uncertain about whom they should trust or how they should navigate the obviously troubled relationships among senior royals. Some feared that speaking honestly might cost them their positions, while others worried that remaining silent might make them complicit in future wrongdoing. Sir Robert listened carefully and then made a decision. He would hold a series of meetings with different staff groups to address concerns directly. While he could not share specific details about family matters, he could reassure people that appropriate measures were being taken to ensure fair treatment for all family members, and that staff who conducted themselves professionally had nothing to fear. These meetings had mixed results. Some staff members appreciated the transparency and left feeling more confident about the palace's direction. Others remained skeptical, having seen too many palace storms weather over the years to believe that fundamental change was truly possible. Kate's charitable work became a focus point during this difficult period. She threw herself into the causes she cared about, visiting hospitals, meeting with at-risk youth, and championing mental health initiatives. These activities served multiple purposes. They fulfilled her royal duties. They demonstrated her commitment despite recent challenges, and they provided her with meaningful work that reminded her why she had accepted this life in the first place. James was assigned to her security detail for several of these public appearances, and he witnessed firsthand how the public responded to her. People lined up for hours just to catch a glimpse of her. Children waved homemade signs, and community leaders spoke emotionally about the difference her patronage made to their organizations. During one hospital visit, James overheard an elderly patient tell Kate that she represented the best of what the monarchy could be. Someone who genuinely cared about ordinary people and used her position to make their lives better. Kate's eyes glistened with tears as she thanked the woman, and James understood that moments like these sustained her through the darkness of palace politics. Back at the palace, the formal review of administrative procedures was making progress. A committee had been formed with representatives from various departments, and they were methodically examining how decisions were made, who had authority over what matters, and where gaps or ambiguities in the system had allowed abuse. James was asked to provide testimony about his observations and experiences. He spoke carefully, but honestly, about what he had witnessed, how the scheme had unfolded, and what warning signs he had noticed. His military background and years of security training gave him credibility, and his obvious lack of personal agenda made his testimony particularly valuable. The committee's findings confirmed what many had suspected. The palace's administrative structure had evolved over centuries through tradition and precedent, rather than rational planning. This had created numerous gray areas where authority was unclear and accountability was minimal. Ambitious individuals could exploit these ambiguities to pursue personal agendas with little oversight. One particularly troubling discovery was that financial allocations and budget decisions affecting different royal households lacked transparency. Money could be shifted between accounts, projects could be funded or defunded, and resources could be redistributed based on decisions made by relatively few. Individuals with minimal documentation or justification. This explained how Camilla had been able to fund the various studies, consultations, and planning efforts associated with her scheme without triggering immediate questions. She had accessed discretionary funds that technically fell within her purview, but had used them for purposes that would never have been approved if their true nature had been understood. The committee recommended sweeping reforms to bring palace operations more in line with modern governance standards. While the monarchy would always maintain some special characteristics due to its unique constitutional position, basic principles of transparency, accountability, and proper oversight needed to be strengthened. As weeks passed, the immediate crisis atmosphere began to ease, though underlying tensions remained. Camilla eventually returned to London and resumed some of her public duties, but her relationship with other family members had been permanently altered. The trust that had been broken could not be easily repaired. Everyone understood that their interactions would be forever marked by what had occurred. There were attempts at formal reconciliation. Family meetings were held where apologies were offered and accepted, at least superficially. Mediators facilitated conversations about better communication and mutual respect. But those who were present reported that the sessions were strained and uncomfortable, with long silences and carefully worded statements that avoided addressing deeper emotional wounds. Kate participated in these reconciliation efforts with her characteristic grace, but James could see the cost it took on her. Sitting across from someone who had tried to destroy her position and reputation, being expected to accept explanations and move forward as if profound betrayal had not occurred, required reserves of strength and forgiveness that would challenge anyone. William was less forgiving. He made it clear that, while he would maintain proper public decorum and fulfill his royal duties alongside all family members, his personal trust had been shattered. He implemented clear boundaries about information sharing and decision-making involvement, effectively isolating Camilla from areas where she might have influence over matters affecting his immediate family. The palace staff watched these developments with intense interest. Alliances and loyalties that had seemed solid proved to be more fluid than expected. Some people who had been closely associated with Camilla began to distance themselves, while others remained steadfastly loyal despite the controversy. James maintained his professional neutrality, but he could not help feeling satisfaction that his decision to speak up had prevented a grave injustice. He had taken a significant risk, potentially sacrificing his career and reputation, but he had acted according to his conscience and his understanding of his duty. Lady Elizabeth called him to her office one final time during this period. She told him that his actions had been noted at the highest levels, and that he should be proud of the integrity he had demonstrated. She also warned him that palace life would never quite look the same to him again. Once you had seen behind the curtain, once you understood how power could be abused, even in institutions dedicated to tradition and duty, you carried that knowledge forever. James accepted her words with somber understanding. She was right. His years of service had always been marked by respect for the institution and those he protected. Now he understood that protection sometimes meant guarding against threats from within. That loyalty required discernment about what truly served the monarchy's best interests. Rather than blind obedience to whoever held authority, the palace continued its work of serving the nation and representing continuity with Britain's long history. Tourists still gathered outside its gates. Ceremonies proceeded with precision, and the royal family carried out their duties with the practiced skill of generations. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, everyone who had lived through these events knew that something essential had changed, and there would be no going back to the innocent assumptions of easier times. 6 months after the exposure of the scheme, the palace had settled into a new normal that bore little resemblance to the way things had operated before. The reforms recommended by the review committee had been implemented with surprising speed. driven by a recognition that failure to make meaningful changes would leave the institution vulnerable to future crises. James Mitchell found his own role evolving in unexpected ways. His demonstrated integrity and willingness to speak truth to power had earned him a promotion to senior officer. With responsibilities that extended beyond traditional security duties, he was now part of a team tasked with monitoring institutional health, identifying potential conflicts of interest, and ensuring that proper procedures were followed in administrative decisions. This new position gave him a broader view of how the palace functioned and how the recent trauma had affected different parts of the organization. He saw the scars left by the conflict and the ongoing efforts to heal divisions that had opened among staff members who had found themselves on different sides of the controversy. Princess Kate had emerged from the ordeal with her public reputation enhanced, though the private cost remained significant. The British people, learning through carefully managed disclosures that there had been internal disagreements about roles and responsibilities, had rallied around her with expressions of support that surprised even experienced royal watchers. Her charitable initiatives received increased donations and volunteer participation. When she appeared at public events, the crowds were larger and more enthusiastic than ever before. It seemed that people sensed she had endured some unnamed difficulty with grace and had chosen to respond by doubling down on her service, rather than retreating or seeking sympathy. James accompanied her on several of these engagements and witnessed how she had grown stronger through adversity. There was a new confidence in her bearing, a quiet authority that came from having faced down a serious threat and survived. She no longer seemed to question whether she belonged in the role she occupied or whether her contributions mattered. One afternoon, while providing security during her visit to a youth center in East London, James observed her spending extra time with a teenage girl who was struggling with family problems. Kate listened with genuine attention, offered encouragement drawn from her own experiences with difficult relationships, and left the girl with renewed hope and determination after the event. As they traveled back to the palace, Kate surprised James by addressing him directly. She thanked him for what he had done months earlier, acknowledging that she knew he had taken considerable risks to bring the situation to light. She told him that there had been moments when she had felt completely alone and isolated, unsure whether anyone in the palace truly cared about fair treatment or justice. Learning that people like him had been watching out for her, had cared enough to jeopardize their own positions to protect her interests, had restored her faith in the institution and in people's basic goodness. James, typically reserved and professional, found himself moved by her sincerity and grateful that his actions had made a meaningful difference. Prince William had taken on an even more prominent role in palace operations, working closely with his father to ensure that the reforms were properly implemented and that accountability mechanisms were functioning as intended. He had also been instrumental in redefining relationships and boundaries with other family members, making clear that respect and fair treatment were non-negotiable expectations. His relationship with Camilla had been irreparably damaged. Though they maintained sufficient civility to perform their public duties without obvious discord, family gatherings were carefully choreographed to minimize awkward interactions, and their public appearances, together, were brief and focused on the event, rather than any pretense of warmth. Between them, Camilla herself had withdrawn from many of the administrative and decision-making activities she had previously dominated. Whether this was by choice or due to pressure from other family members remained unclear, but the effect was that her influence within palace operations had been substantially reduced. Some of her longtime supporters argued that she had been unfairly vilified for actions motivated by genuine concern about institutional efficiency rather than personal malice. They claimed that the reforms she had proposed, while perhaps implemented imperfectly, were needed to clarify roles and prevent confusion about responsibilities, but most people who knew the full story rejected these revisionist interpretations. The careful documentation maintained by James and others made clear that the scheme had been targeted specifically at Kate, that it had been developed secretly to avoid scrutiny, and that its purpose was to diminish her position rather than improve organizational effectiveness. The truth was that Camilla had seen Kate's popularity and effectiveness as a threat to her own standing within the family hierarchy. Rather than accepting that multiple family members could make valuable contributions in their own ways, she had attempted to eliminate what she perceived as competition through bureaucratic manipulation rather than honest confrontation. This failure to embrace collaborative leadership had nearly caused a catastrophic breakdown in family unity and public confidence. The exposure of her scheme had instead accelerated changes that made such concentrated authority more difficult to exercise in the future. The media coverage of these events, carefully managed through strategic leaks and official statements, had focused on modernization efforts and improved governance structures within the palace. The specific details of what had been attempted against Kate remained largely confidential, protected by the same discretion that had always shielded internal royal family matters from public scrutiny, but enough information filtered out through various sources to create a general understanding that there had been serious disagreements, that inappropriate actions had been taken, and that corrective measures were being implemented. Public opinion generally sided with Kate, whom they viewed as hardworking and sincere, against unnamed others who had allegedly tried to undermine her. This public support proved valuable in other ways. It gave Kate leverage to pursue initiatives that might otherwise have faced bureaucratic obstacles. Proposals she championed received more favorable consideration, and resistance that might previously have derailed her projects melted away. In the face of her enhanced standing, she used this capital wisely. Focusing on substantive programs rather than personal aggrandizement, she expanded mental health services for young people, created new pathways for disadvantaged youth to access education and employment, and championed causes related to early childhood development. Her work was making tangible differences in people's lives, which further reinforced her legitimacy and importance. James watched these developments with a sense of vindication mixed with continuing vigilance. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but he understood that human nature and institutional dynamics meant that new challenges would inevitably arise. Power would always attract those who sought to abuse it, and protecting the vulnerable would require ongoing attention, rather than a one-time intervention. His expanded role gave him opportunities to mentor younger guards and staff members about the importance of integrity and speaking up when they witnessed wrongdoing. He shared his own story selectively, using it to illustrate that doing the right thing often required courage, but that institutions depended on people willing to take those risks. Some of the younger officers listened eagerly, inspired by his example and eager to emulate his principled approach. Others seemed skeptical, believing that keeping one's head down and avoiding controversy was the safer path to career advancement. James understood both responses, remembering his own younger years when he had not yet faced tests that revealed what he truly valued. The reforms implemented after the scandal included regular ethics training for all palace employees, clear procedures for reporting concerns about misconduct or abuse of authority, and protection for whistleblowers who came forward with legitimate information. These measures created a framework for institutional integrity that had been lacking in the traditional system based solely on personal honor and discretion. Lady Elizabeth Fairfax, who had played a crucial role in navigating the crisis, announced her retirement after decades of distinguished service. At her farewell ceremony, attended by the entire royal family and senior palace staff, she reflected on how institutions evolve through adversity and how the monarchy's greatest strength had always been its capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. She spoke without mentioning specific individuals or events, but everyone present understood that she was referencing the recent crisis and its aftermath. She expressed confidence that the changes implemented would serve the institution well, and that future generations would benefit from hard lessons learned during difficult times. James attended the ceremony in his dress uniform, Standing among colleagues who had also served with dedication through the turbulent period, he felt a connection to these men and women who had remained committed to their duties even when the institution they served had been tested by internal conflicts and ethical challenges. After the ceremony, as guests mingled during the reception, James found himself in conversation with several senior officials who thanked him for his role in exposing the scheme. They acknowledged that his actions had been uncomfortable for everyone, but ultimately necessary to prevent greater harm and to prompt needed reforms. One elderly advisor, who had served the monarchy for over 40 years, told James that every generation faced moments when the institution's character was tested. Sometimes these tests came from external threats or public controversies. Sometimes they came from within, when people forgot that their positions were meant for service rather than personal advantage. The old man said that James had helped ensure that this particular test would be remembered as a moment when the palace chose integrity over convenience, when people demonstrated that loyalty meant protecting what the institution stood for rather than blindly defending those who held positions of authority. As winter approached and the anniversary of the initial discovery passed, James reflected on everything that had changed and everything that remained the same. The palace still stood as a symbol of continuity and tradition. Ceremonies still proceeded with precision. The royal family still carried out their duties, representing the nation at home and abroad. But beneath that consistent surface, there were new currents of accountability and transparency that would shape how the institution operated for years to come. The assumption that senior family members could exercise authority without effective oversight had been challenged and found wanting. In its place, a more balanced system was emerging that recognized both the need for leadership and the importance of checks against abuse. Kate continued her work with quiet determination. Her position now secured not because someone in authority granted her protection, but because the systems themselves had been reformed to prevent the kind of targeted campaign she had endured. She had become a symbol of resilience and grace under pressure, qualities that resonated deeply with the public. William had proven himself capable of the kind of decisive leadership that would serve him well in future roles. His willingness to confront difficult situations directly rather than allowing them to fester had earned respect even from those who had been affected negatively by his actions. Camilla remained part of the family, but with diminished influence and the permanent stain of having attempted something that most people recognized as fundamentally wrong. Her legacy would be complicated by this episode, remembered not just for whatever positive contributions she made, but also for the moment when ambition overcame ethical judgment. James understood that his own story would become part of palace lore. The guard who spoke up when speaking up was difficult, whose actions triggered changes that affected everyone who worked within these historic walls. It was not a role he had sought, but it was one he could be proud of having fulfilled according to his understanding of duty and honor. He continued his rounds through corridors that had witnessed centuries of history, past paintings of royals who had faced their own challenges and made their own choices about power and responsibility. He thought about how institutions survived, not because they were perfect, but because enough people, in crucial moments, chose to uphold principles rather than personal advantage. The palace lights glowed warmly in the gathering darkness as James completed his evening patrol. Tourists photographed the building from outside the gates, unaware of the dramas that played out behind those imposing walls. They saw only the surface, the ceremonial grandeur and historical significance. James knew better. He understood that institutions were made of people, with all their flaws and virtues, and that maintaining integrity required constant vigilance. The scheme had been exposed and defeated, but the underlying human tendencies that enabled such schemes remained. Future guards would need to be equally watchful, equally willing to speak uncomfortable truths when necessary. As he returned to the guard station to complete his reports, James felt at peace with the choices he had made and the consequences that had followed. He had served his oath faithfully, protecting those who needed protection, even when the threat came from unexpected directions. He had helped ensure that justice prevailed and that the institution he served emerged stronger from a test that could have broken it. The story of what happened would eventually fade into palace history, becoming one more chapter in the long record of challenges faced and overcome. But for those who had lived through it, the lessons would remain vivid and relevant, shaping how they approached their responsibilities and what they demanded from themselves and others in positions of trust. The night settled over London, and the palace stood as it always had, solid and enduring. Inside its walls, people who had been changed by recent events continued their work, carrying forward traditions while embracing necessary reforms. The future remained uncertain, as it always did. But the foundation had been strengthened by truth-telling and the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it.